Okay, so this is week 6, and we've talked about excavation and stratigraphy and things like that, and now we're getting into the second third of the semester where we're going to actually look at the materials that you obtain after an excavation, how you analyze them, and what they tell us as archaeologists and anthropologists. And so a big important part of this is typology. So one of the exercises you guys are doing this week involves typology. Typology is essentially dealing with the mass of things that you get after an excavation, right? So you can see here a big, large pile of pottery fragments. Archaeologists call these typically sherds, S-H-E-R-D-S, potsherds. And you can see all different colors, different shapes. This is what we would call an assemblage. An assemblage is the full collection of a type of material. So you can have a pottery assemblage, you can have a lithic assemblage or stone tools, you can have a ground stone assemblage. So those are all the grinding stones that you'd use to grind grain, for example. We'll talk some more about that. And so what is a typology? Well, typology is essentially a classification that people create, that archaeologists create according to the physical characteristics of those items. It is an artificial construct, just like taxonomy in biology, right? So to make sense of the enormous variety of different organisms in the world, biologists created, with Linnaeus, the taxonomic system. Kingdom, phylum, class, order. You've all done this in biology class, where you're starting with things that these animals all share, right? So maybe Animalia, so they're all animals, and you get down to ones that have spinal columns, chordata, and then you get to Mammalia, and then subcategories of Mammalia. So you're grouping things based on the similar characteristics that they share. Now, there's actually a different way of classifying biological organisms according to how people think closely related things are evolutionarily. This is called cladistics, and there's actually kind of a debate within biology whether it's better to organize things based on similar shared characteristics or where we think they go in the evolutionary tree. Okay, and what that shows is that there's different ways of organizing things. And it's the same in archaeology, right? There's different typologies that can be created. There's things that are based on formal attributes. So these are, as we're going to see, descriptive typologies. They're based on physical features, stylistic attributes. These are physical features too, but these are things that are deliberately made by people to maybe as decoration, or maybe it has nothing to do with the shape of that artifact, but it's something that's completely stylistic, like painting on the outside doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the shape or with the function. Function deals with what those items were used for, what the ancient people used those things for, and then technological attributes, how those things were made. So how do you create a typology? Well, that's one of the things that you're doing this week. You're taking a mass of pottery and you're organizing it into two different typological categories. And one of the questions on the lab, which many of you saw already, was a kind of a trick question. When I asked which typology is correct, I think most of you realize, well, that's kind of a silly question. And it is, right? There is no correct typology. It's all based on what you are interested in, what the archaeologist is interested in. Right? So if you have certain research questions, you'll create one kind of typology. If you want to answer a different set of questions, you'll create another kind of typology. So the same set of artifacts can have different typologies created, and you might use one typology to answer one kind of question. You might use a different typology to answer another kind of question. There could also be overlap sometimes in typological groups. The whole point of all of this is just to make order out of chaos. We like to organize things as human beings. We don't like chaos. We tend to like things grouped into categories, and we do this on our own, right? So if we have to organize things in our notebook or in our desktop folder, or or in our computer, we'll start making folders. Maybe we'll decide, okay, I'm going to put all the PDFs for class here. I'm going to put all of my notes in this folder. I'm going to put music here. I'm going to put movies here. And people could do it completely differently. I've even seen some students that have little color tabs that they put sometimes in their notebooks to indicate different things. That's essentially a typology too, right? We like to put things into groups. This is not always good, obviously. Sometimes these groups don't actually deal with reality, but we like to put things into groups. That's the way the human brain tends to work. Okay, so stylistic typologies. Well, here's an example of a very specific kind of style. You might recognize the shapes of these vessels. When you looked at seriation last week and you put pots into order, you saw some of these different shapes. This is very specific to a kind of culture in South America called Styles-Chavin culture, with lots of decorations of jaguars and also these very distinctive shapes to the vessels, right? So this really doesn't have, you have a spout, you have an empty hollow space. Those are kind of the functional attributes, or the morphological attributes. The flare in the stem, the fact that it's double stemmed here, that deals with style. The decorations on the outside, those are all embellishments that deal with that specific group of people, right, and their style. And we can see different stylistic developments in our own culture, right? So, clothing is a very obvious one. Clothing styles can change over time. Clothing styles can change or can vary by region, not just of the world, but sub-region. So, people in, let's say, one state might dress slightly differently than people from another state, or people of, let's say, a certain subculture, like Goths, or what have you. I don't know. Are there any Goths left? I forgot. Might dress a certain way to kind of show membership, let's say, within a subgroup. So how do archaeologists use style? Well, you have to be very careful with style in archaeology, but a lot of times when archaeologists are digging up sites, many sites will not have writing. You'll have pottery, you'll have stone tools, you'll have bones, you'll have architecture. So how do we, let's say, identify who these people were? That can be very, very difficult. And sometimes the only way you can do something like that is with style. And as we've talked about before, one of the most ubiquitous artifacts found in archaeological contexts is pottery. Because pottery breaks, it has to be replaced, but ceramics, as we'll see next week, is kind of an indestructible substance, which means it accumulates in large quantities in archaeological deposits. So you end up with lots and lots of pottery, and people could decorate the pottery in many different ways. And sometimes it is specific, or archaeologists think it is specific to a geographic region. Okay, so this is in northern Colorado. This is a site called Mesa Verde. This is the ancestral population to the modern-day Hopi and Zuni tribe in the southwest of the United States, who live specifically in a site called Mesa Verde. And nearby, at a site called Chaco Canyon, you have a similar kind of style, but there's also distinct features of it. And so archaeologists can separate these out. Some of the pottery that you're looking at in your typology exercise comes from the Southwest. So some of this might be familiar to you, this kind of black on white geometric decoration. Right? And so you can create stylistic typologies based on geographic region and maybe even talk about an archaeological quote-unquote culture, right? So you can have the ancestral Pueblo, the Mogollon culture, the Hohokam culture, Sinagua, Casagrandes, etc., where there might be a particular style that is more common in that region than, let's say, another region, and that you can distinguish them. Now, these groups have to be kind of well defined. What does that mean? It means that a typology will work if, when you make these groups, there's more similarity within the group than there is between groups. Right? That is, if you have too much overlap, if, let's say, you take two vessels from two different groups and you have decided to lump them into those groups, but those vessels actually have more alike with each other than they do with the other members of their own individual group, then those are not very well defined groups. Right? And so sometimes you can develop a system to actually, once you develop a typology, a stylistic typology, you can then sometimes create a system where you can take new artifacts, answer these kind of yes or no questions, almost like a, like a tree, a dendritic tree, right? Yes or no, go to this, yes or no, go to this, and end up putting it into groups. So sometimes, for example, the earliest agricultural people in Europe tended to have this kind of linear pottery, which we call the linear band ceramic people. Sometimes we use pottery, many times we use pottery to identify a culture. But archaeologists like to warn other archaeologists that pots don't equal people. Right? That a certain style of pottery doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about an ethnic group, a racial group, or a defined group of people. That is, you can have overlap linguistically, ethnically, racially between styles of pottery and these other groups. Right? So two different groups of people could distinguish themselves with pottery, but not necessarily. So you have to be careful. You can say, all right, this is the Mogollon pottery people. What does that really mean? Are these really, is this just two different, slightly different cultures? How different are they? So that's what you kind of have to be wary of. Stylistic typologies help us answer some large questions. Once we can describe, let's say, a certain pottery style is very distinct from those around it, we can then see what happens with that pottery style over time. So, for example, this very burnished black pottery called Transcaucasian ware originates in the Caucasus, up here in Armenia and Georgia, and in the 3rd millennium, so about 2600 BC. And over time, this pottery spreads. It's found in sites all the way down to Iran, all the way down to Israel, side by side with local pottery. Now, what does it mean to find this kind of style all the way, hundreds of kilometers away from Caucasia? Well, there's different explanations. It could be trade, right? So the pottery is being traded over long distances. Maybe people from the Caucasus are bringing the pottery with them as they migrate. Maybe they're trying to distinguish themselves from other people. Maybe it's just the styles that are moving, and then the local people are making pottery according to that style. So these are some of the things that stylistic typologies help us answer. Identify groups, identify trade, and look at some of these other questions.